Well, here we are beginning our discussion of the fourth chapter before our first examination. We're adding components as we go along, laying a foundation for how all of this fits together. You may remember that we began by looking at, just in the broadest sense, the nature of communication, and we've moved through that to the anatomy of communication process. We've talked about language. And we've now going to give ourselves a chance to talk about information and uncertainty. One of the themes that runs throughout the course, and particularly for those of you that are taking careful note and want all of the crib information that you can get, one of the questions asks about meaning. And I'm going to preview our discussion of information by tying that to a theme that's run throughout since the anatomy chapter, and that is that meaning is interpretation. Information is interpretation. Sort of to recall where we were in chapter 3, let me point to a passage on page 128 where I say meaning is oriented to the efforts of each individual to make sense, to solve problems attached to the functional reasons for conversation and the functions that the conversation generates, meaning that we're in a conversation and meaning that grows out of that has something to do with the function of the conversation. Why are we talking? Now, one of the elements of that is that meaning is interpretation. Meaning is interpretation. Meaning is interpretation. And I emphasize that theme because it then allows us to address the relevance of there we go. That screen should have been much earlier. The relevance of information. One of the challenges that I have as a person guiding your tour, I often think of myself in this course as a tour bus driver. And we're in this bus going along, and I point out the windows. Take a look out the window and see what you see. At various times, what I've tried to bring to your attention is that some of the assumptions that you've made, some of what you've thought you knew, may not be actually right, or there is an even more refined way of thinking about it. So what we want to do is to orient ourselves to the nature of information. We want to look at some of the assumptions that go into the understanding of information and the use of information to understand the communication process, definitions of information. We're going to talk about a term that some of you may have encountered in other classes, the concept of entropy. And finally, we're going to look at two different theories of information and the use of information. And I have in my pocket a deck of cards. I promised you last time that if we get far enough today, we'll play a card game. And a deck of cards is just ideal to talk about information because of the nature of the cards. And so we'll be able to compare two different theories or contexts or applications of information by looking at what we can call a fixed decision model versus the impact model. And then the latter part of our discussion together, we will focus on the context in which information becomes relevant to us. A little bit of the reflection of where information becomes relevant to us can help us to sort of orient ourselves to where we are, because I'm guessing that many of you think that you're in the information business, being interested in communication. We even have something now that we call the information society. As much as 20 years ago, people began to argue that as a nation we were moving away from a manufacturing society to an information society, and that instead of being manufacturing workers, we were going to have information workers. One can argue that the entire rationale of the dot-com boom on the stock market in the 90s was driven by the notion that software, hardware, would allow us to reshape our society and manage information in different ways, ever more productive ways, ever more interactive ways, and so it was going to change the way we lived, the way we worked, perhaps the way we thought, the way we bought, the way we sold, etc. So when the question comes up is, what is information? If it is so powerful that it can redefine society, do we have to impress upon ourselves that old phrase that many of us grew up with, and that is, information is power. Information is power. Now, this also takes us back to the theme that we discussed in Chapter 2, and that is, in a sense, does information have more to do with something along the line of exchange? Information exchange. We like to talk about information exchange, don't we? And there can be a context in which information exchange can be very relevant to the dynamics of that process. Can you imagine negotiation, for instance? Negotiation. I'm negotiating with you for the sale of my house to you. Do I exchange information with you? You give me information, and I give you information in exchange. Is information exchange in that sense something that is reasonable? Does a newspaper exchange information with you? Probably less so. But then that brings us to another model, and that is either providing information or transmitting information. Providing information or transmitting information. Now, providing may be different than transmitting. We can look at that. But we like to talk about, I'm providing information to you because I'm a teacher and you're a student. In that regard, is something actually flowing from my brain to your brain? Is there a linear communication mechanistic model, a magic bullet model operating here? Or does information go more like this? I make statements which you interpret, and from the interpretation of those statements you hope you get what I think to be informative. Is that what the communication process is? That I make statements, you interpret those statements, and you're hoping that what you say, what you get from my statement, I will see as being what I wanted you to get, that you became informed. When you answer as you do on an examination, are you informing me what you think the answer is? And then I decide whether your answer, in my opinion, is rewardable or not. Is that what that process is all about? Is that how it works? If you write a definition, is it accurate or is it inaccurate, or is it partially accurate, or is it fully? Let's see, we can even get into partials. We talk about that a little bit later on. What about getting information? Are you information seekers? One of the assumptions that we make when we think about the mechanistic linear model of communication is that information flows to us and we're sort of passive users, passive somethings in that process, but we may be very active seekers of information. Is the likelihood that you become an active seeker of information on this course likely to increase as you get closer to the examination? One of the factors that we have to build into our understanding of communication is that we're information seekers. Do we seek information in interpersonal communication? Do we want to know what this other person is like? Is this a friendly or an unfriendly person? Is this a threatening or an unthreatening person? Does this person love me or does this person not love me? And is that the realm of information? Is that the realm of information? If I go away interpreting that person's reaction to me as this person loves me as opposed to this person hates me, is that based upon information which I've acquired by watching what that person did, hearing maybe what that person said? One of the segments that we've got available for you to look at examples is the segment from Cupid. I apologize for my artistic selection here. I know that there are probably people in the English department and the theater department that shudder that I would encourage or expose you to that show. But I think it's an interesting show. Why I got interested in it, I will not know. But when I watched it, I said, this to me looks like really relevant, not only to the information chapter itself, but also to the uncertainty reduction chapter, which is part of interpersonal communication. Because one of the arguments is that dating behavior is uncertainty reduction. I'm trying to reduce uncertainty as to whether this is a reasonable mate with whom I'm going to cast my fate. And Lisa in Cupid is trying to figure out with her two buddies, the Rottweiler sisters here, whether they actually think Lisa's right. And sometimes they agree and disagree. But we read what other people do and say and try then to figure out, based upon that information, which we interpret in our own idiosyncratic way, whether this is a likable, unlikable person, whether this is a friendly, unfriendly person, etc., etc. So one of the themes that runs throughout information theory is that information is basically there, one, as interpretation, and two, to help us to make decisions, We want to make decisions, we need to make decisions. These questions address that. Can information be transferred or transmitted? Well, not in the same way that a product can. I ordered a book the other day from a publishing company. That book comes from the company to me. So the book is transmitted, but did the company transmit information to me? Well, maybe. How much information is in that book? Is it a fixed amount of information, or is the amount of information in that book subject to interpretation? Do I find the book informative, or do I find it not very informative? Because sometimes we even approach news that way. Now, I find it rather interesting that our curiosity in the hurricane Isabel coming in is a whole lot different when it's coming into North Carolina than if it were coming in to Galveston. Unless we're on our way to North Carolina, or we have property in North Carolina, or we have friends in North Carolina, or we're just interested in storms. Meaning that information has something to do with the relevance of the information to us. One of the predictors of us seeking and knowing something is the relevance of information to our self-interest. There is a theory that we will see later on called involvement theory that suggests that our willingness to get information and use it is a direct reflection of the way in which we think that information will solve a problem relevant to our self-interest. You as a student, I as a teacher, are managing involvement, aren't we? You are involved in what I think is information because you know that if you give it back to me, as I think you should, you get better rewards than those that fall short of the expectation. So it's, in a sense, sort of a commodity in that regard. It has exchange value, doesn't it? Information can have exchange value. We can even charge people for information. Does the Houston Chronicle charge you for information? Do websites charge you for information? Do publishers charge you for information? Sure. One of the other themes I want to talk about is entertainment television. Is that informative? Children think that entertainment television is informative.
I think it's informative to a degree, maybe in social activities and
social activities. What are the relevant scripts? How do you go about doing things? How do you pick mates and so forth? What scripts work? What scripts don't work? How much of the television and or the motion picture market is tailored to helping adolescents solve problems that adolescents face? I would say a lot. Teen magazines, is it also likely that women have much more serious information acquisition needs than boys? There are a lot more women's magazines out there and girl magazines. There are 17. But if I'm a 17-year-old boy and I pick it up, is it going to tell me much that I would necessarily want to know? Maybe so, because it allows me into the mysterious world of women. And that in and of itself is something, isn't it? Which means then, even in social management, we at times want to be mysterious to one another. We want to be mysterious to one another. If I want to know how much you like me, can I demonstrate disliking to see if you work hard to get me to like you again, or to demonstrate that I should like you? Oh, now it gets complicated, doesn't it? Because when we're children, we take a lot of things for granted that we can't when we're adolescents. Can information occur even if it isn't exchanged? Sure. Somebody tells you they're not going to a party and you show up and they are there. Their presence is information. Is it exchanged? Not really. You just see them there and then you want to know why they're there. Okay. Information and uncertainty. To what extent is uncertainty uncomfortable? To what extent is uncertainty uncomfortable? To what extent do faculty members take advantage of the discomfort of uncertainty as a part of the educational process? To what extent is your ability to survive in the educational process, or to thrive in the educational process, your ability to successfully manage that uncertainty? So we deal with this issue of uncertainty. And uncertainty is a way of defining information. Many of you will define information as something that is a fact. Something that is a fact. But facts also have to be contextualized, don't they? How I interpret that and the amount of information that I interpret in that statement may differ from you based upon my interest or my curiosity or my whatever it might be. Is information uncertainty in one way or another related to randomness? Randomness. Some of you have in other classes perhaps encountered something called chaos theory. Have you? Yes? No? Some of you? Maybe so. Do we like chaos? Is it also possible that what seems to be chaos to some people is not necessarily chaos to other people? Let's think about that for just a moment. Is it possible that all of the sounds and all of the ways in which sound can be put together is a potential for crafting music? Is that something that is a potential for crafting music? All of the sounds and all the ways that sounds can be put together. So that if I get ready to write a song, a symphony or whatever it might be, do I then begin to select out of this sort of random availability of sound the sounds which I think work together, perhaps to become informative of an emotion? To become informative of emotion? All of the words that I could select out of the dictionary. Dictionary is a big, thick thing. All of the words, each of those words is the potential information, randomly arranged, that I could then select from to put together. So one can argue that part of the human instinct is to seek order in a otherwise random world. Is that a fair statement? I know that some of you worried last time that we were going to get very zen about this. Maybe we have. But is that a fair way of looking at it? That the world is full of randomness and we don't like randomness. We want to reduce randomness. We want to become informed in ways that help us to manage uncertainty and manage randomness. Well, let's see if that is a starting point for us here. Whoops. I will find where we are here momentarily. Obviously not at the moment. This is really interesting television for those of you watching it on television. I know that if my printed transparencies are right, that there are some additional pages here that seem not to be on that particular finally, I got where I wanted to be. All right. One of the ways of looking at this is to examine the concept of entropy. Examine the concept of entropy. Entropy is a principle of physics. That principle has two dimensions to it, and that is that the world around us is constantly in a state of going toward disorder. The world around us is constantly in a state of going to disorder. Now we can stop for a moment and examine that, can't we? If I go down to the store and I buy myself a banana, am I likely to pick a banana that I think is very, very good, very edible? If I take that banana home, and this is particularly relevant to us guys, right? I take that banana home and leave it around for several days, forgetting that I bought it, is that banana likely to become increasingly random? Meaning that the molecules begin to lose their association as edible food, although we are willing to eat it even then, if it's the only banana left in the house. It's like the peanut butter in the back of the drawer that we find and it's just got a little bit of green on it. We're still willing to eat it, aren't we? Well, that's another issue. But that banana, from the time we buy it, is on its way toward increased randomness. It's going to get so mushy that I certainly don't like it. I don't like really mushy bananas. Why did it get mushy? Because of the notion of entropy. Entropy means that things begin to break down. If I go out and have something made out of iron, will that iron rust? Will that iron rust? Is rust the principle of entropy? Some of you delight perhaps in going to the beach and making sandcastles. Some of you delight in going to the beach and watching other people make sandcastles. We have a contest every year. And it occurs to me, since that contest now is what, a few days, weeks old? Why don't we go down to Galveston this weekend and look at all of those sand sculptures down there? You want to go? And you say, but they're gone. Where did they go? They became random. Now, if you have a 4-year-old grandson, you can better understand randomness, because kids will take a lot of time to put something together and then quickly make it random. They'll put all those blocks together and then they'll tear them up, particularly if the younger sister begins to put something together. Then there is an incentive for the older brother to bring randomness. Randomness is taking something that has a kind of structure and moving it from that structure to randomness. Okay, question?
So what's the difference between randomness and entropy?
Entropy is characterized by the tendency to go toward randomness.
Is it a result?
It is a process, I would say. Entropy is a process by which things move toward randomness. I hate to tell you, but each of you are about as good as you're ever going to get. You're going toward randomness. As we sit here today, you're beginning to break down. You break down every day anyway, But the nice thing about people your age is you rebuild pretty good. Now, you're not rebuilding as well as my 4-year-old grandson and my 2-year-old granddaughter. One of them cuts themselves, and in a few days, that cut is completely gone. But if great-grandmother cuts herself, that can be quite a different matter, right? She's not as able to regenerate herself. And I'm just telling you, having gone ahead of you, I'm the explorer, tell you that randomness. Also, what you see today as a nice, firm sense of self can over time become enormously unfirm, flabby and so forth, and there are certain events in your life that will be startling to you. Never, let me suggest this, never at some point in your life stand in front of a mirror and hold the sides of your face up, because all of a sudden you'll realize what gravity has done to what you once thought was an enormously attractive face. Gravity is having damaging effects on us. Well, randomness. Entropy. Entropy is that process by which things go. Now, in the news gathering world out there, a lot of events happen in a given day. Many of you are challenged in journalism classes to define what is news. Is what is news out of all of those random events those which are what? Most interesting, most valuable to the interests of your readers? And out of that random world of things happening, certain things get selected as news based upon editorial policy. And you can sell it for value because you paid a lot of money to get that information, which you could then package and present. Is that the nature of the news gathering process? Because we don't put every event in the world that occurs in the newspaper, in the news magazine, or on television every day. It is a selective process, isn't it? It is what we think is the most informative, the most likely to satisfy our readers, our viewers, our listeners' interest in knowing something. Now, randomness and uncertainty are first cousins, aren't they? Is the same thing as saying all of us is going toward randomness, the same thing as all of us going toward uncertainty. Meaning that time is occurring and we don't know what tomorrow is going to be, do we? We don't know what tomorrow is going to be. We don't know what the next minute is going to be. We sometimes don't stop and think about that until we have the opportunity to see on television, and I saw it this way, that while we were sitting in Agnes Arnold in an office watching the replay of the first plane fly into the World Trade Organization, we had the horrifying experience of seeing the second plane fly into the World Trade buildings, World Trade Towers. In a second, all of what we thought was, in a sense, orderly can become disorderly and change. Well, in a sense, that's what news value is. News value is trying to figure out what of all of this randomness is most valuable to people. And we could argue that at least one of our motives for buying the newspaper, tuning into the evening news, watching this, is to reduce some of our uncertainty about what's going on in the world, what's happening. What is threatening? What is rewarding? What is good? What is bad? We drive some of these issues, and that also can help us to understand the way in which information and persuasion tie together. One of the arguments that I make early in the chapter is that it is probably quite unfortunate if we try to assume that there is an easy and absolute line that can be drawn between information and persuasion. Let's imagine, for instance, that you write a news story in which you characterize these events. And I heard this on television the other night. 4 men break into an apartment and shoot a guy 9 times. Is that informative? Is that persuasive? Is it not also persuasive? Why would it be persuasive?
Because of the word choice, break into a house.
Okay.
It could have been already in the
It is also persuasive to the extent that it could influence my decisions, what I want to do, what I think. Could it also be that I wonder whether this is really true or not? So if I am an informative reporter, it's because I persuade you that my information is good information, is verifiable information. So in one sense, a fact is only as good as its ability to stand up against scrutiny, so I have to think of it then persuasively. Do advertisements persuade us? Do advertisers use information to persuade us? They tell us characteristics of products, the availability of products, what we can use a product for. Do we always believe that they're telling us the truth? Not necessarily, do we? We'll even talk about that later on to suggest that we are, as individuals, fairly skeptical about advertising in general, but we often are more willing to believe specific ads, particularly if we have ads that confirm the world as we know it. Confirm the world as we know it. So persuasion, if I tell you I love you, is that informative or is that persuasive? Both. Do I have to prove that I love you? Is proof information? Is information proof? So that even in social interaction, we are both informing and persuading. There is a theory of interpersonal communication, and that is that we persuade other people to like us. Do you think that has some merit? We persuade people to like us. But in doing that, we provide information about ourselves that would make us appear to be a likable individual. How do I demonstrate to you that I am likable? When you tell a joke, do I laugh? When you're feeling really bad, do I say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," in a way that you believe that I am sorry? So see, we become informative to one another. To what extent do I know you, independent of what either I see you do and say, or what I hear people say about you? To what extent do I know you? To what extent is your behavior informative? And to what extent does that information influence whether I like you or dislike you, continue to like you, or begin to like or dislike? You see what I'm saying is, we now begin to see this model. Well, see, what happens then is that out of this entire world around us, there is all of this potential lack of predictability, amount of randomness, uncertainty, and so in one way or another, communication has to do with the management of uncertainty, the creation of the frames of interpretation so that we share some interpretations of reality. We talked about that in the chapter on language. So, entropy, one of the definitions of it is that it is the amount of disorganization that exists in a system. If we can get that slide up, then people can see it. I thought it was up. I'm sorry for that. There it is. Entropy, the amount of disorganization that exists in a system. When you come to the university from high school, is the University of Houston at least apparently disorganized? Apparently disorganized. By the end of 4 years here, do you have a pretty good idea of how to manage the university? Is part of your survival in an organization your ability to bring predictability to a potentially random set of experiences? Are people in the organization supposed to help you to do that? Do we help you to do that? Do staff people help you to do that? Do we put up signs? With our PRSSA chapter one time, we did a study of the campus, and one of the things that we learned was that most of the buildings on campus had no signage, so nobody knew where any building was. We hadn't figured that out. Why? Because most of us had been here forever and we knew where everything was. But imagine coming here for the first time and saying, what is the name of these buildings? So we went out and we picked Texas Tech's colors to make all of the signs. Drives me nuts. Why are those signs red and black? They should be red and white with black lettering. Our colors are red and white. That's who we are. But, well, anyway, another thing. Lack of predictability. The amount of uncertainty. The randomness. The randomness that exists around us. And then the principles of the management of entropy. The principles of the management of entropy. A child comes into the world. Imagine. Can you? I don't think most of you can recall. How random do you think the world seemed to you as a small child? What meaning did all of the stimuli have around you? Even the sounds of these strange people, what they did, the odors, all of this kind of stuff. And at some point you imagine that you've got to be able to manage all of this stuff. Which takes me back to my basic model or theory or principle, if you wish, of what communication is all about. And I will say that communication has to do with social influence. It has to do with collectivities where we work together within a society to manage uncertainty, to manage randomness, to manage all of these matters in the world around us. And I will argue that the rationale for at least part of the media industry is the fact that we're willing to pay money for people to go out and spend time trying to cut through this randomness to give us some sense of what's going on. When we look in the chapter on mass-mediated communication, we're going to talk about a variety of the uses that we have of media, and one of them is going to be surveillance. Surveillance. Is that why we use the media, to surveil the world around us? I saw in the style section of the Houston Chronicle today what the fall fashions are coming out of New York. Now, as a guy, I looked at it and said, oh, ho-hum. I don't think I'm going to buy any of those dresses, so I guess I don't have to pay any attention to it. I bet my wife doesn't buy any of those dresses. And my daughter is this strange combination of looks good in anything, and typically the cheaper it seems to just look better. I don't know. I mean, she's just one of those people that just gets by with, really fairly inexpensive stuff. So when it would be down in the corner, maybe this dress costs $8,000 or $2,000, I thought, I don't think we're going to, run the old MasterCard bill up very much, right? But I nevertheless paid some passing attention to it. I could give you some idea. But then I also have to realize we go back to meaning and we look at issues like gender. Will women look at that the same way that I did? And what's even more troubling, right? I know 5 colors in the whole world, maybe 6, maybe 7. And then you talk to women, oh, this year's fall fashion is avocado taupe. Oh, really? I didn't know there was avocado taupe. I thought it was, what, blue-green, yellow-red, pink-orange. I mean, I remember back when we had coloring boxes and, everybody said, oh, good, look, we got 55 colors in our coloring boxes. And I'm thinking, why do you need more than 4 or 5, Well, women love all those colors. My wife, when we were building our new house, went into an absolute tizzy. What colors am I going to paint the walls? I don't care. Paint them white for all I care. Well, I have to paint them something else. And now, you see, I don't even know which bucket of paint goes with what, because we've got all of these exotic names of this paint. Well, you see what I'm getting at is, all of this is bringing some degree of predictability, because now, you see, if I have to go down to the store and buy a set of paint, I got to know what paint and what's the name and what's the number and all of that, because I can't just walk into a store and say, I want paint. Because if I show up with just paint, my wife is going to be upset with me. So you see how we manage this notion of uncertainty. We manage this notion of randomness, and it becomes important to us. We talk about our crosswalk over here. There's a certain element of randomness and uncertainty. Are those people in those cars really going to stop or not? Now we got signs up out there. We're making progress. I even saw people intimidating cars for the first time out there. I see this as a great victory. Well, you say, what does this have to do with Cupid? Cupid started off with every conceivable guy in the world showing up. And those of us that saw the first episode saw some of the biggest bozos. You're my Cupid expert nodding your head. Some of those people didn't seem to me to be date bait, huh? I'm surprised that some of those people were not institutionalized, right? One guy thought by saying, "I want to be your Latin lover," that became a running joke throughout the whole show, the Latin lover guy. Now, I don't know where his ego is today, but I know where his body wasn't, and it wasn't next to Lisa in the last episode there, right? So, theoretically, every guy in the world can show up and say, "I am available," and then they sort out of all of this randomness down to 20. And then within a week, they went from 20 to 10, and then each week, they went further and further through that list to the point that on the very last episode, they were down to Hank and Robert. Well, in a sense, lo and behold, this brings us to our fixed decision model, and I was so pleased to see that screen came up because I could then have the dramatic flair of it being the right one. Now, the fixed decision model, we have two ways of looking at how we use information in making decision. And I promised you that we could play cards in here. If I haven't lost one, and I hope I haven't, there should be how many cards in this deck of cards? 52. And I'm going to find myself an ally up here to pick a card out of this deck of cards. Because the question that I'm going to ask you is, what is the least number of guesses, choices we have to make to reduce our uncertainty to zero that we know which card was drawn? Does that question make sense? We have to at least ask one question, don't we? What would be the maximum number of questions that we would have to ask to find out which question had been drawn? Nope, just 51. Because 51 will allow us to then know what the answer is to the last one. Now, one of the characteristics of information and the use of information is that information can be measured in terms of bits. Bits. Now, what is a bit of information? It is any characteristic of information that can reduce uncertainty by half. It is a characteristic of information that can reduce uncertainty by half. Sounds very complicated. How do computers think? Bits, binary. If I hit a key and I'm trying to write an article, the computer says that's either A or it's not A. It's either B or it's not B. It's either uppercase or lowercase. And then, and this is about all I know about computer programming, so those of you that are experts will then see how I quit this story very quickly. If I translate all of the letters of the alphabet and all of the commas and quotation marks into numbers, I can then account for how a word processing program can take each of those keystrokes and translate it into something that can be stored and utilized. It's either 127 or it's not. It's either 13 or it's not, so that every one of the letters has a number associated with it. Child comes into the world, or you have cheated and looked early. And the doctor says, it's a boy. Binary, isn't it? As far as we know, the choices kind of boil down to two, boy or girl. Now we know that there's a little bit more of a random model out there. It even gets more random if we begin to talk about sexual preference rather than sexual characteristic. And even then that gets to be kind of random because we have heard that certain people are in the wrong body. So, you know, it's all kind of fuzzy. I come from a time when it all seemed to make sense and then it all got to be very fuzzy, right? But anyway, the notion is that if we can define all of this down and begin to quantify it, we can translate it into bits. Yeah?
Can't I figure out what card you've drawn by asking 15 questions?
You could probably, and you've jumped just one chapter ahead of me, but that's where I wanted to go. What would be, knowing what we now know about bits, what we know about randomness, what we know about a fixed decision model, what would be the most probable number of questions that we would have to ask to answer with certainty what card had been drawn? No. 5 or 6 or maybe 7, somewhere in that range. 5, 6, or 7. Let's see what happens. You're such a quiet person. Let's get you involved in this. Let's let you select. Now, don't show anybody because, people will cheat. You look very carefully so you know that I don't cheat. All right? Now, don't say anything, but give it back to me because I need to know. Otherwise, this will not work. All right? If everything worked right, she and I are the only 2 people in here that know what this card is. Now, using what we just learned, a fixed decision model, there are limits as to how many questions we would have to ask. Let's begin. What's the first question you want to ask? And by that, you should be able to eliminate 50% or half of all of the items. Yeah. No, let her. Red or black? Is that your question? Yes. It is black. What is the second question you want to know? Well, I would have guessed that you might go even a little bit direction, yes?
Is it a club?
It is not. So we've now eliminated 75% in 2 questions, each of which divided randomness in half. Does that make sense? Do you see how that works? Now, what's the next question you want to ask? We're getting close to our 5, aren't we? Yes.
Is it even or odd?
It is even. Yes. It is not a face card. How many questions? Are you keeping track? I even thought it was 5. Was that 5 or was that only 4? Was it 4? Okay. I usually do it on a board. I'm a chalk guy. So I could probably do it here, but then that would be just challenging me. And you know how easily challenged I am with all of this paraphernalia. Okay, we're at 4, and we know that it is an even spade that is not a face card, right? An even spade that is not a face card. You want to go next? It is below 5.
Is it 2?
It is not 2. Which means then, with certainty, we know it's 4, isn't it? Which means that he knew the answer to that, so you didn't have to answer that question unless she didn't trust you and me, that we'd pulled something else out of the hat here, right? So how many questions did we ask? 6? It's usually right in that. That's why you said 5. I said we might be able to make it, but it's likely to be 6. It takes about 6 questions to go through that. But the irony of it is that we could do that over and over and over again if we had players as smart as you with a little bit of guidance from me to keep you from making a mistake too early in the game. Now, see why I call that a fixed decision model is that we have a limited number of choices to make. Computers like to think in terms of fixed decision models, don't they? Which makes some of us in the world very uncomfortable. I like ambiguity in my life, and computers really don't. Computers really don't. Password or not? Login or not? See, it's binary. It's binary, isn't it? A bit. Either you got the right stuff in there or not. I was horrified this fall when Sean, our super technician over there, said, you not only have to know this accurately, but it's case sensitive. I'm the kind of person that even likes it to be typo sensitive. And so here I am typing in, and it wiggles. It says, nope, nope, and then all of a sudden it runs. Binary. See how the world works out there? But it's because it is a fixed decision model. Now, is life always reducible to a fixed decision? Is life always reducible to a fixed decision? We're about to twist our heads around one more time in here. Is it possible that we can argue that the amount of information in any one message is a result of the increase or decrease of uncertainty we experience based on that message? The amount of information in a message, meaning that if I hear a news story, in one sense, I'm supposed to feel a reduction of uncertainty, aren't I? But is it possible that I can get information and now feel increased uncertainty? Feel increased uncertainty. That becomes very, very relevant to us when we get into the matters, for instance, of news and or of interpersonal relationships. Because what we find out about an individual may increase my uncertainty rather than reduce my uncertainty. And remember that we often don't like uncertainty. We often don't like uncertainty. And yet we know that sometimes we try to create uncertainty in our interpersonal communication. We try to be unpredictable. Do we like a certain degree of unpredictability in other individuals around us? In a romantic relationship, do we want everything to be routine? My wife and I are very predictable when it comes to card giving. I never forget. My wife never remembers. So we're both very predictable. Does she like my predictability? Do I like her predictability? So see, one of the things that we're building up to is even to think about likes and dislikes as measures of uncertainty, because that translates us into something called attitudes. Attitudes. If I buy a particular flavor of ice cream that I've never tried before and Bluebell every once in a while introduces a new flavor, am I going to like it? Don't know. Now, if it has chocolate and cherries in it, I'm on my way. If it has strawberry in it, eliminate that. My grandson the other day tried to persuade me that strawberry was good. I got over that years ago. I don't know where it was, but I lost interest in strawberry. Love citrus. So see, we develop certain kinds of taste, and then we taste something, and then we can even go so far as to say, is it really good citrus? Meaning that we can even estimate when we go to a restaurant how well we like that restaurant, or whether we dislike that restaurant by the extent to which it met something on this scale. Now, let me flip back the clock a little bit. Do you remember, oh, heaven's sakes, Dr. Heath, that was several days ago, when we talked about somatic space? No, I forgot about somatic space. I will remember somatic space by the examination, though. Somatic space. Remember when we said that Osgood, Susie, and Tannenbaum talked about the measurement of meaning? These guys were working at about the same time that our friend Norbert Wiener, who was one of the big information theorists, were. And one of the questions is, to what extent when we measure meaning, are we also measuring the degree to which something is more or less certain, more or less informative? More or less certain, more or less informative. Meaning that, can meaning transpire in a range rather than an absolute of yes or no? Well, let's see. Our friend Neil Frank or any other person giving the weather, do they tell us tomorrow will be beautiful or wretched? Is weather reporting binary or relative? Is weather reporting binary or relative? Yes.
It's relative because they'll give you a number.
They'll give you a percentage. A 40% chance of rain. A 20% chance of rain. The chance of rain will be different in the afternoon than in the morning. So one of the assumptions that we make is that it is often difficult to simply break the world down into binary units of analysis. So the assumption then is that one of the tests of the informativeness of a message is the effect that message has upon our feeling of being more or less uncertain once we have interpreted that message. Now let me use a little example. I'll tell you a story. I love stories. The story has to do with a family that woke up one morning in England and they went downstairs and they found two facts. One was that the bureau drawer in the dining room was pulled out, and the second fact was that the silverware in that room was missing. The silverware that was in that drawer was missing. It was not there. Now, how many of you believed that the silverware was stolen? Some of you said, we've been with you long enough to know that there's likely to be a trick in this story. Aha! All right. They looked around in the room and they found one additional fact. The window to the room was open, and they talked and they discussed that the window had been closed when they went to bed the night before. Now, in this, do you begin to feel that your sense of certainty that the silverware was stolen increases or decreases by my giving you information? We can count for any number of reasons why the silverware was not there and the drawer was pulled out. Somebody took it, we didn't know it, it's at the neighbor's, we loaned it, somebody moved it, any number of things. The window being opened, that may make us more suspicious. We call Scotland Yard. Scotland Yard comes in and finds two more facts. One was that the window was pried open from the outside. Does your sense of certainty that the silverware was stolen gone up? Second fact, on the inside of the window frame is the palm print of a known house burglar by the name of Joe. Do you feel yourself going up more certainty? The truth of the story, some hours before the crime was committed, a crime was committed. Joe and his partner began to argue whether they were going to continue a life of crime. During the argument, it broke into a fight. During the fight, Joe was killed. His partner, being the clever man that he was, severed Joe's arm and took it with him, so that when he was leaving with the silverware, he pressed Joe's palm print against the window so that Joe only had a hand in that crime. They don't pay me to teach this course. They just let me tell that one joke. I love that one joke. But what's interesting is we can feel ourselves going up in terms of certainty. We poll for that, don't we? Do you think that certain mayoral candidates are going to win? Do you think that certain mayoral candidates are more deserving? Do you think that Bush is doing a good job? Do you think that Bush is doing a bad job? You see, our opinion, our beliefs slide up and down in this range of strength of opinion, strength of belief, strength of attitude, whatever it might be. Well, what we're talking about there is then the notion of the receiver impact model, where the estimation of the amount of information in any message is our own sort of subjective sense of the effect of that information on our degree of certainty, And information, therefore, in a sense, can increase or decrease our sense of certainty. You go out to buy a product, you talk to one person who is representing a product like a refrigerator. Does it seem like that refrigerator may be a good product after you've talked to one salesperson? You go talk to another person, and it now may be that it seems like another product would be better, and that product may not be so good. I think we started late this morning, so we ought to stop a little bit, right, earlier. We've still got about 5 minutes, but I think we started late. So we'll stop here, pick this up, and when we return on Thursday, compare these two theories again, firm up our sense of understanding of the difference between the fixed decision model and the impact theory, and then we'll begin to explore by context the nature of information. Bye.